This move, nf3, is a common and flexible starting move that develops a knight towards the center and prepares for castling, while also keeping options open for various well-established opening systems. This move develops a knight to its most natural square, controlling central squares and maintaining flexibility for black's pawn structure, mirroring white's opening approach. This move is a flexible and common response in many Indian defenses, aiming to control central squares and potentially transpose into structures like the English opening or a King's Indian attack setup. This move prepares to develop the kingside pieces and control central squares, potentially leading to various solid defenses like the Queen's Indian or Nimzo Indian defenses. This move develops the knight to a natural square, preparing to control the center and supporting a potential d4 pawn push, common in many Indian defenses and English opening variations. This move, often seen in systems like the Reti or English opening, aims to quickly challenge white's central control by pinning the knight and preparing to develop the bishop actively. This move initiates a Catalan-style development, aiming to fianchetto the kingside bishop to g2 where it will control the long diagonal and support central control while preparing castling. This move prepares to fianchetto the light-squared bishop to b7, aiming to control the long diagonal and potentially challenge white's queenside development. Developing the bishop to g2 reinforces the kingside and prepares for castling while controlling the long diagonal, a common strategy in many queen's pawn openings. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to influence the center and prepare for castling, aligning with a common strategy in fianchetto openings. Castling kingside completes development of the king and prepares to connect the rooks, solidifying the king's safety and facilitating future queen and rook activity. Castling is a crucial defensive maneuver that connects the rooks and safeguards the king, an essential step in this Catalan opening setup. This move attacks the b7 bishop, forcing black to decide whether to exchange it or defend it, which can influence the pawn structure and piece development on the queenside. This move proactively contests the queenside and aims to hinder white's potential queenside expansion by creating counterplay on the a-file. This move boldly claims central space, preparing to challenge black's queenside play and potentially open lines for white's pieces. This move prepares to develop the kingside knight to e7, potentially reinforcing the d6 square and facilitating further kingside pawn expansion or a kingside castle defense. White repositions the rook to the open d-file, supporting the d4 pawn and preparing for potential central pawn advances while reinforcing king safety. This move strategically prepares to expand on the kingside and potentially challenge white's central control by creating a kingside pawn lever with g5, while simultaneously preventing white's knight from jumping to g5. This move develops the bishop to an active square, aiming to contest the long diagonal and prepare for potential pressure against black's queenside. Black exchanges the bishop for a knight, disrupting white's pawn structure and potentially creating weaknesses on the queenside while improving black's piece activity. White recaptures the bishop, establishing queenside pawn majority and opening the c-file for potential queen activity. This move solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares to develop the queen's bishop, aiming to complete the development of the queenside. This move shores up the queenside pawn structure, preparing to develop the b2 bishop and potentially support a future c5 break. This move prepares to challenge white's control of the d4 square and potentially develop the c8 bishop to a more active diagonal. The move bc1 is a defensive maneuver, retreating the bishop to support the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential d5 pawn breaks, while also opening the c-file for future rook activity. This move prepares to connect the rooks and potentially redeploy the queen to a more active square, while also supporting a future e5 pawn advance. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the center and preparing for potential queenside play or a kingside attack. This move challenges white's queen and aims to simplify the position by trading off the light squared bishops, a key piece for black's control of the long diagonal. This knight maneuver prepares to redeploy to a more active central square, potentially supporting a kingside attack or reinforcing the center after black's bishop has been exchanged off. This move removes white's active bishop on g2, simplifying the position and preventing it from influencing the kingside for the moment, though it does open the g-file for white's rook. This knight repositioning aims to activate the piece on the kingside, supporting a potential kingside pawn advance and preparing for future tactical operations in the center. This move prepares to contest the d5 square and potentially advance the c-pawn, aiming to gain central space and activate the queen. This move prepares to contest the central c-file and supports potential pawn advances on the queenside. This aggressive pawn advance challenges white's queenside pawn structure and aims to gain space, but it weakens black's queenside pawn chain by creating an isolated pawn on b6 if white can consolidate. This move aggressively seeks to destabilize black's pawn structure in the center, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and potentially create weaknesses around black's king. This captures the central pawn and initiates a pawn structure dynamic where white has a central majority and black has a queenside majority, setting the stage for queenside play. This capture opens the c-file and creates a doubled pawn for black, which could become a target if white can pressure the c5 square. This pawn capture opens the c-file, creating dynamic pawn tension and forcing white to consider immediate recapture or face a potential material advantage. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, potentially preparing to contest the d5 pawn or I weaknesses on the kingside. This pawn sacrifice opens the a-file for your rook and removes white's central pawn, creating a dynamic imbalance in the position. This recapture opens the a-file for white's rook and creates a passed pawn on the b-file, aiming to leverage increased piece activity and potential queenside pressure. The rook penetrates to the second rank, activating the piece and targeting the queenside pawn structure. This move prepares to challenge the rook on a2, aiming to eliminate black's active piece and gain control of the open a-file, which will be crucial for white's queenside expansion. Black has traded a rook for a rook on the a-file, simplifying the position and creating an open file for white's remaining rook to potentially exploit. The recapture of the bishop on a1, while seemingly simple, solidifies white's control of the crucial a-file and opens the a1h7 diagonal for the rook, creating immediate threats against black's kingside. The rook on a8 activates along the open file, aiming to challenge white's control of the a-file and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. The rook is repositioned to the b-file, aiming to activate this open file and potentially contest it with black's rook. Black's rook maneuver to a2 aims to exploit the open a-file and potentially create threats against white's kingside or pressure the a3 pawn, activating an otherwise passive piece. The king now moves to a safer central square, unblocking the rook on f1 to potentially support central pawn advances or kingside operations. The knight repositions to e5, aiming to exploit the weakened squares in white's camp and potentially create threats against the g2 bishop or d4 pawn. This move is a decisive tactical blow, forcing the black king into a vulnerable position and setting up further attacks with the remaining pieces. The black queen now retreats to f8, a necessary repositioning to escape the check and defend against potential further threats, while also preparing to contest the crucial central files. This move simplifies the position by exchanging queens, leading to an endgame where white's bishop pair might offer a slight advantage in open lines. The exchange of queens has led to a simplified middle game where white's king now becomes a more active piece, potentially supporting a central pawn advance or assisting in the defense of its own king. This exchange simplifies the position, leading to an endgame where white's bishop pair potentially offers greater long-term pressure against black's isolated d-pawn and less active pieces. This pawn recapture on e5 re-establishes a symmetrical pawn structure in the center and opens the d-file for potential endgame play, while also centralizing the pawn. This knight sacrifice targets the d5 pawn, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's pieces while simplifying into a favorable endgame. This move recaptures the knight and simplifies the material on the board, leading to a slightly better pawn structure for black in the ensuing endgame by removing white's active knight. This rook exchange simplifies the position and leads into an endgame where white aims to exploit the open file and potentially create a passed pawn. The rook on a5 now contests the open d-file and prepares to support potential pawn advances on the queenside. This move advances the rook to the 6th rank, aiming to control the open d-file and pressure black's king and pawn structure while potentially creating passed pawns. The rook on b5 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure by attacking the b3 pawn and potentially creating dynamic play on the queenside. The rook redeploys to a more active central file, aiming to contest control of the d-file and prepare for potential pawn advances or harassment of black's king. With the rooks now on the same rank, the king's most immediate priority is to activate itself from its passive corner position and prepare to contest the open d-file and potentially support central pawn advances. The king now centralizes, aiming to participate in the endgame by supporting the d-pawn and potentially controlling the e-file. The rook's maneuver to a5 aims to challenge white's control of the a-file and prepare for potential pawn breaks or piece exchanges on the queenside. This move begins to create an escape square for the king on h2, potentially preparing to centralize it and activate it in the endgame. The king seeks to actively participate in the endgame by moving towards the center, aiming to control crucial squares and support potential pawn advances. This move repositions the rook to the open c-file, aiming to control it and potentially create pressure on black's queenside pawns or the c7 square. The king actively ventures towards the center, aiming to participate in the endgame by controlling key squares and potentially supporting pawn advances. This check forces the black king to a more exposed square, aiming to exploit its current vulnerability and gain positional advantage. The king must escape the perpetual check and find a safer square, as continuing on the d-file exposes it to further immediate threats. The rook is now attacking the pawn on a4, creating immediate pressure and forcing black to defend, while also potentially repositioning for future action on the d-file or the 3rd rank. This move repeats the position, suggesting neither side has a clear path forward, and white should consider breaking the symmetry to create imbalances. The rook's return to d3 repeats the position and is a passive move, White should instead consider advancing the h-pawn to create attacking chances on the kingside or challenging black's rook activity on the queenside. This move seeks to improve the rook's activity by moving it to the d5 square, potentially preparing to contest the open d-file or support a pawn push. This repetition of moves indicates a potential lack of progress. Consider diversifying your positional approach or seeking tactical opportunities to break the stalemate. This move is a subtle positional maneuver aimed at preventing White's rook from becoming active on the h-file or creating attacking chances against the black king by offering a pawn exchange to simplify the position. This move prepares to centralize the king and potentially support a pawn advance on the kingside. After consolidating the rook's position, the move 40, g6 develops the pawn structure to create a more stable pawn chain, reinforcing the kingside while potentially preparing for kingside pawn advances in the future. The king's current maneuver to e2 is a sensible consolidation, aiming to bring the monarch to a more active and secure central position in this endgame-like structure. The rook on a5, after a series of exchanges, is now actively positioned on the kingside, aiming to challenge White's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay. This move aims to secure the e4 pawn, preventing black from potentially creating a passed pawn on the d-file or using the e4 square for an active piece. This move is a tactical opportunity to disrupt White's king's safety, forcing it to move again and potentially losing time if White reacts passively. The king is centralizing to participate more actively in the endgame, aiming to control key central squares and support potential pawn advances. This move brings the rook to the second rank, aiming to exploit the open b-file and potentially create passed pawns or attack the white king. The king steps back to f1, seeking a safer square on the back rank after the rook on a2 became a pawn, preparing to contest the open c-file or potentially support pawn advances on the kingside. This move aims to reinforce the pawn structure on the queenside and prepare for potential pawn advances, creating space for the king and preventing White from easily infiltrating. The king is forced to move again, reiterating the lack of progress in black's position and allowing White to maintain control of the central squares. Black's king must actively participate in the endgame, and moving it to e6 aims to centralize and support the pawn majority on the queenside. The rook on c3 is repositioning to control the c-file and potentially support a pawn push on the queenside, aiming to create a passed pawn. This pawn push aims to gain queenside space and potentially create a passed pawn on the b-file, while also challenging White's rook on c3 and improving black's king safety by creating an escape square. White repositions the rook to challenge black's advanced pawn structure and the vulnerable b-pawn, aiming to disrupt black's coordination. This pawn push injects dynamism into the position by challenging White's central pawn structure and aiming to create immediate pawn breaks on the kingside. This pawn capture, while superficially appearing to open lines, actually weakens your king's position and allows black's rook to penetrate to the second rank, potentially creating significant threats. This pawn capture on f5 opens the g-file and creates an unbalanced pawn structure, aiming to exploit the potential for kingside play as the game transitions into a simplified endgame. This move aims to activate the king on the kingside and potentially support a pawn advance, while also preparing to defend against black's queenside pawn push. This move opens a crucial diagonal for the king to potentially become more active, while also preparing to advance the pawn to challenge White's central control and create a passed pawn. This move repositions the rook to a more active square on the 8th rank, threatening to advance the passed pawn and restrict black's king. This move creates a passed pawn on the queenside, aiming to use it to gain material or create a decisive breakthrough. The rook check forces the black king to a more exposed square, allowing white to potentially create threats against the black pawn structure or king. The move 51, kf6, is a necessary reaction to the check, repositioning the king to avoid further immediate threats and preparing to consolidate its position. In the endgame, this move activates the rook on the f8 square, forcing the black king into a discovered check situation and creating an immediate threat to win material or disrupt black's coordination. The king is exposed after the queen exchange and must find a safer square, as white's rook is poised to deliver checks along the 8th rank. This move forces the black king back, preventing it from finding a safe square and consolidating its position on the queenside. The king is now centrally positioned and ready to support the pawn advance on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay. The rook move to f8 is a decisive attempt to force an exchange of rooks, aiming to reach a favorable pawn endgame where white's passed pawn on the 6th rank can become a decisive factor.